Good morning, friends. This morning we are having a interesting talk by, if I were to give him his proper title, that would be Dr. Charles Gamble, who will be giving us a talk which is entitled Wind Energy, What It Is, and why it is important to the climate crisis.
Thank you.
Sounds good.
Now, can anyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Right, excellent. So, title, if that's the title.
The device already ready to connect.
So, I shall just begin. As long as the earth turns, the sun shines, we'll have wind. It's inexhaustible. It's caused by the differential heating day and night of sunlight and warming the atmosphere, changing the pressure, hot air rises. The earth turning makes the movement of that quite complex, but the air on the hot side, i.e. the daylight side, tries to go to the dark side, and in doing so sweeps around the planet in very complicated but very predictable patterns. And we know the westerlies, the roaring 40s, the doldrums, they all result from the same phenomenon in the turning of the earth.
Charles, by the way, we are seeing your slide sort of view, so we can see your slide and the stuff around it.
I'll try this and tell me if this works. Does that work?
Often, yeah, yes, that does work.
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So I'm from the northeast. I'm getting some feedback from someone's microphone here. So
Okay, let's everybody mute as much as possible.
So the fossil fuels that we've used traditionally for generating energy work like this. I grew up in the northeast and I was trained in power stations a bit like this. You can see there's about 1 million tons of coal piled up in this heap with a bulldozer on it outside of a large coal-fired power station. The diagram, which I'm not going to go through any detail, says that basically you grind up the coal at several tons per second and put it into a boiler. There's a huge flame, and immediately you do that, all of the CO2 and a third of the energy in the coal goes up the chimney. It's stripped just like that. The resulting energy, so you've got rid of a third of it, half of the remaining energy goes into the turbine. Sorry, the remaining energy. Half of the remaining energy then ends up in half of the remaining energy ends up in the condenser, which ends up in seawater or the river or the cooling towers. So you've ended up with getting rid of 1/3, then another third, and of the remaining third, a percentage ends up as electricity, which people buy and then use to put the light on in the bathroom, then leave the light on when there's nobody there. So it sounds like a good plan, and it worked really well. The percentage of energy in the coal that ends up with electricity in a power station like this, coal-fired, because of the high pressures and temperatures, is quite good. It's 34%, 36%, and and that's the best we could do. Now, in a nuclear power station, because they can't run the boilers at the same pressures and temperatures because they are technically unsafe, it only makes about 20% of the energy, 28% of the energy in the fuel ends up as electricity, and all of the rest of it ends up as heat. There's no CO2, but when we build Hinkley, there'll be about 7,000 megawatts of heat going into the Bristol Channel, which would mean we'll be boiling the fish. I will come back to that briefly. So I thought that this was a wonderful piece of technology, but morally and spiritually a bad thing to do. And when I was about 30, I went off to join the madness that was the Californian wind energy business, a very immature industry. And it looked like this, lots of little machines spinning around, a lot of them falling over. And it was created by the oil shock of the 1973 time, and all governments tried to do something. And at the small end of the scale, many governments recognized they had a real problem, including the UK and California and Denmark, the Netherlands. Denmark had no source of gas or oil. It felt that it's a windy coastline. They would find out how to capture the wind. So hundreds, dozens and dozens of little companies, American, Danish, Netherlands, and some English ones, set up to build wind turbines. And the Danes kind of used sort of boat building and agricultural tractor type technology, and some of them were quite successful, but they all went bankrupt every year. That's because the Californian tax credits expired at midnight on December the 31st.
Charles, you've just somehow muted yourself. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Right.
We lost a minute there.
The Danish government decided that this industry, despite all of its entrepreneurial little companies going out of business every year, was too important to fail. Now, we use the same term talking about banks. Now the Danes have about the 5th biggest and enormous manufacturer of wind turbines, and the UK has none. But it was an exciting time. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are 4 turbines, of which that's out of 20. I helped build those in about the late, about 1986. And I'm sitting on top of one of them one day, and it's standing still, and the westerly winds are blowing through San Francisco Bay, bringing in the fog inland to the Altamont Pass, and it's being dragged in by the hot inland desert. And you can feel it sitting on top of those, the chilly airs blowing past the machine. And it was just one of those lovely evenings. And I reached inside because it was a small turbine, pressed the start button, and the anemometer above my head spinning, sensing the wind, and the machine points itself into the wind. And after about 90 seconds, took the brake off, and the blades start to rotate slowly. You're standing on top of this thing that's moving like a horse, and it's bouncing backwards and forwards and going side to side. And eventually, after about another 30 seconds, it's up to speed. And then it goes dung, and it's connected to the grid, and it leans backwards under the thrust. It's like being on a live animal. And it was converting this invisible air into invisible electricity, just like that. And I was hooked. That's a quote from Contact. I was hooked. This is magic. As an electrical engineer, this power conversion, so clean, so immediate, was just a drug on which I was hooked. Fast forward, now there are very large wind power stations, like thermal power stations of the same sort of size, onshore and offshore. This is Scotland, and this is offshore, doing a job which is converting not 28 or 30 odd percent of the energy in the fuel, but nearly 50% of the energy in the fuel is converted to electricity. The fuel is free. You can't get 100% of the energy out of the wind, because if you did, it'd be a dead calm behind the blades, and where would you put the air that was coming in? So 50% is very, very good, much better than thermal power. No CO2, none of that stuff. So about 7 years ago, I started to work with David Tudgy, who led me towards a project which the council and the region of Lawrence Weston, which is quite impoverished on the west of Bristol near Avonmouth, had decided from their local community plan that as well as the solar plant that they'd built, the 4 megawatt solar plant, they wanted a wind turbine. And David said to me, I said to him, if you can find, I don't know anything about solar, but if you can find me a spot for a wind turbine, I will build it. And this is what we're building. So this is a modern machine. It's 4.2 megawatts, which is nearly the same output as that entire wind farm that I built in California in the 80s. There was 20 machines there. Now there's only one here, and this produces more. It's 150 meters high to the tip, 92 meters high to the center of the rotor, and it'll be built in early February next year. It took a long time. And we're very proud of this. But of course, the Danes and the Germans would be looking at us saying, You must be joking. We've been doing wind power and we put up turbines like that every day. We're putting up one. This is the only turbine in England because the government basically made onshore wind illegal in 2015. And we need actually about 5,000 a year, not one a year, 5,000 a year to get anywhere near our climate change targets. So anyway, I'm paraphrasing what I've got here, but I just want, I usually say it just takes 7 things to build a wind turbine. The community is crucial. You need planning, approval, you need some money, quite a bit of it. You need wind, you need the turbine technology, a grid to connect it to, and someone to buy the electricity. Sounds simple. And in our case, you can see that this took about 6-7 years now. Community engagement and support throughout. We had 100% support from the local community. And I won't bore, I'm going to go through the little detail of these as we go on, but just 7 things. But I'm wrong. An 8th is essential because energy is political, completely political, as you'll see. So here we are at the moment in this lovely part of the world. We're getting Hinkley, and currently the index price at which you will have to buy electricity is about £130 a megawatt hour. That's 13 pence a kilowatt hour. That sounds like a bargain since your domestic electricity is probably 30. You won't be able to buy it for 13. You will be sold it at some premium over what it is at the moment because we'll be obliged to buy nuclear electricity. We're not getting the Swansea Bay barrage. We're not getting the Severn barrage. Despite the fact that, well, you know, the cost of nuclear in terms of the cost of energy per megawatt hour in real terms for wind has dropped dramatically in the last where are we at, 10-11 years. It's come from 150, that's 15 pence a kilowatt hour, down to about 4, and it's still going down. So if you can produce wind at about 4 pence, we should be able to sell it to people at an economic number which is affordable. The market for electricity, which I don't want to go into because I don't understand it, is broken. So we all are paying 34, 35, 36 pence. On the same graph, you'll see Hinkley is already 2.5 times what you can get offshore wind for and going up all of the time. Wind is important to people and communities. Too many areas, most regions of the country have had wind power done to them. We had decided to have wind power by and for the community and own it, true ownership with real benefits to the community. So we had to set up the right corporate structure. It's a CIC. There are no shares, so some ownership can't be transferred off to some other remote entity somewhere. It's permanently owned and only by the community, and the profits can only flow to the community. So this is not a novel legal structure, but it's the first time it's been done here for wind. And in Germany, it's done all the time. You know, Germany produces something like 11 or more % of its energy entirely from community-owned wind turbines. And in this country, it's a very tiny amount, which is why we end up buying our energy from the big corporates who are generally French or German or somewhere else. Sorry, David, I know you're an expert in this and you'll understand I'm just rushing through.
It's lovely.
Well, anyway, so the community is so important. That is the first thing you have to have. And practically, you need their support, otherwise you will not get planning permission. The government's statement, which makes onshore wind illegal, has not exactly a loophole, but it requires 100% support from the community. I mean, if one person objects, that's it. Your entire development is wasted. So in Lawrence Weston, they've got a very active community managed by Mark Pepper. Now he is a super guy, and organized the community over the previous years and so on to have a consistent approach and a completely democratic approach to creating community plans. And the first community plan they created said, you know, we would like this, and it said, well, the community plan will last 10 years. Well, in 5 years, they'd done everything, ticked all the boxes. One of the things they did was to defeat Bristol City Council's desire to build private houses on a tract of land and bring in a supermarket, because there were no shops. The schools had been closed down, the usual kind of deprived area. Lawrence Weston is in a ward which it shares with some rather wealthy sections like Blaze, Castle, and so on. So on average, it's about average, but in fact, it's one of the worst 10%, among the 10% most deprived communities in England. So they followed their plan. Their second plan said, let's have some energy, and they ended up building a 4 megawatt solar farm, and then said, like, we have the ambition to build a wind turbine, which is where I came in. And the planning of that has cost, well, I'll go into the costs later, but the written statement by our lovely government basically made it illegal. And we had to go through enormous expensive hoops to put up one turbine. So the environmental studies for this turbine cost around £200,000. You know, you have to look for everything from bats, grace-crested newts, flight corridors, boards, birds that are nesting on the shore because we're on the estuary. It's a Ramsar site. There's a SSSI site over there, which is the estuary. Archaeological heritage sites, intervisibility with other people, risks to national infrastructure, like we're near a railway line, a main road, a nationally important oil pipeline, a gas pipeline, a gas-fired power station, 132 kV substation, and some neighbours, and we had and plus all the local flora and fauna. So it was a really expensive exercise to put up one turbine, and it doesn't need to be that way, really. So that was the second thing we need. So it's a massive thing to do planning. When we got planning about 2.5 years ago, we thought that's it. Once you have planning on a wind farm, you've basically got most of the asset there. The rest of it is doable. Finance. Very, very difficult to get finance. Development finance is all risky. Most developments fail. The lessons learned are the political risks of a government coming in and making it illegal, made lots of development companies bankrupt. Individuals lost a lot of money because they were developing projects, lost everything. Thank you to the Tories. Very difficult to raise, but we got some small amounts of money from Urban Community Energy Fund, that's now gone, and then engaged with the local community Port Community Resilience Fund for regeneration of the area. They gave us 100,000, Power to Change 150,000, Bristol and Bath Regional Capital 150,000, and so on, and Bristol Community Energy Fund 78,000, and the accountants among you will see that comes up from like 400,000 or so. Development finance, very risky. As I said, if it had all fallen apart, I would have had to emigrate. I would have not been able to look people in the face. Construction finance is easy. Once you've got, you know, the blocks in place, permitting and so on, construction finance from Triodos or Thrive Renewables and BBRC is available. You need to go through quite a process to make it happen, but people are keen to lend to ethical projects like this. We also had £500,000 from West of England Combined Authority, which is European money. Thank you, Europe. The fourth thing you need is wind. This is the only thing you can't change. Everything else is negotiable. So in the beginning, I took my passion for wind and understanding of it to taking a step back from finding that site. The council had offered us their portfolio of possible of land that they owned, thousands of sites, including little parks and urban areas and so on, which you couldn't build a wind turbine. And the council had an ambition to build a small wind turbine, one of these things, just making some kind of statement. I wasn't interested in that. I wanted to build a proper power generation thing. And so I triaged these down to, from the hundreds to a few dozen, and matched where they were likely to be with the probable wind speeds. And there's more wind near the coast. We're not a windy part of the world, but I looked at Dundry Hill, which is lovely and windy, but didn't think I'd get planning permission, and the council don't own any land on it. So we were pushed, as it were, towards the coast. And you can see on this graph, there's a set of isovents, which is the lines of equal wind speed. So this is a very, very top level and rough wind speed assessment. And it happens to be in the Sevenside industrial area, and came across 3 or 4 sites, and one of them which we'll come to, but all of them very, very constrained for all kinds of reasons. So yes, I've talked about the constraints there. So the other thing, so once if you got the wind and the other things, then you can move on to thinking about the turbine. This is the bit I like. I'm a technology freak, and I'm a freak anyway. So turbines used to be in the 1980s hand built by people in little sheds in Denmark, and they would, or in America, and they'd fall apart. And they would. Today, these are stuffed full of hundreds of thousands of lines of software code, massive technological advances, advanced components. You've got Kevlar, carbon fiber, GRP, and lots of clever stuff in the blades and in the drivetrain and so on. And they are quite big. The one we're getting is in the middle of this picture here. It's taller than the London Eye, not quite as tall as the post office tower. And it's, well, bigger is better, because really what matters with a wind turbine is the surface area that it's sweeping out. So the diameter of the rotor, in our case, is 115 meters, and somebody's going to calculate how many square meters that is. But the energy in the wind is, X amount per square meter, and the more of it you capture, the better. The other thing about the wind is that it's windier higher up. Anyone who's been on a hill or in a tall building will recognize that. So turbines near the ground suffer from 2 things. A, it isn't as windy, and B, there's a lot of turbulence near the ground. You just have to walk through an urban environment. When it's windy, you're getting buffeted around. If you were up in the clear air, it's very steady and strong. Being so large, you have to consider transportation. These things are big and heavy, and you have to get all these components in. So part of the development risk money is spent on transportation studies, including dry runs, of which we'll have 2, with a real trailer carrying a real fake blade to see if it can get around all of the bends. And it's successful first time. I don't see why it shouldn't happen this time around. You've also got a very small choice of manufacturers, because the industry globally has a handful of onshore turbine manufacturers. There's the Chinese with Goldwind, there's the Danes with Vestas, there's the Germans with Siemens, who are entirely invested in offshore, and again the Germans with Enercon. And 2 of the German companies in the last 10 years went out of business. So, consolidation, it's a difficult market to be in, quite political. So there's a handful of suppliers. At the small end, there's a medium-sized turbine I'll just mention called Emigia Wind Technology, EWT. They make them around 1 megawatt, about a quarter of the rating and a 1/6 of the size of the one we're getting. So they've got a bit of a slot in the market too. But anyway, I didn't want one of those. I wanted a big one, because bigger produces more energy. This is a cross section of a turbine. Blades on the left. The there's a little red man on the right. The scale of these things is utterly enormous. You can see the blades are attached to a very large hub through a huge set of bearings, and the blades are rotating to match the wind speed. The entire thing is sat on the tower. Well, let me just get to that. Behind the blades is this large rectangular object. That's a generator. It's got a rotating part, which is blue, and a stationary part behind that. This is some huge diameter, and it's not a permanent magnet machine. We hear a lot about magnets being required for the wind turbines and cars and phones, and this doesn't use any permanent magnets. It uses a wound field rotor. This entire thing is mounted on a shaft, which is going up the middle, which is supported on the top of the tower on another bearing, such that it can rotate around on the tower and point into the wind. This thing that you're looking at weighs about 350 tons. So it's quite a lump of mechanism, and you've got to get it up in the air with one of the biggest cranes you can get, which we will have delivered to site in February. Wonderful piece of technology. And it doesn't have a gearbox. Gearbox has proved to be a bit of a athlete's, what's it? Ankle. Anyway, what's the word when someone has a, anyway, not athlete's foot, but the ankle thing. Anyway, gearbox is largely gone. So all of the manufacturers.
I think what you are asking for is an Achilles heel.
I knew it was an athlete's Achilles. Yes. So thank you very much. So direct drive is the way to go, and most large turbines, including offshore, are using direct drive and either magnets or no magnets. And this today offshore is a very small machine. Offshore machines are now being produced at 8 megawatts and 200 and something meters diameter, twice the size. Phenomenal. So anyway, I won't bore you with that any further. The other thing you need is a connection to the grid. Practically, you can connect it to 11,000 volts or 33,000 volts. And the regulations are very complex because the grid from which we get our distribution and from which we get our electricity is, obviously it's not owned by us. It's owned by, in our case, Western Power Distribution, or now National Grid Energy Distribution, which is a privately held company, basically. So they haven't been incentivized to continue to uprate the capacity of the grid. So getting grid connection for new generation is difficult. And indeed in Avonmouth, and partly because of Hinckley, long-term plans are laid to say, well, the grid in the west part of, in this part of the country, is dedicated to shipping power from Hinckley to the rest of the UK, and small projects like this are kind of pushed to one side. So it's difficult to get a grid connection. You could be in a long queue, and there could be constraints on how much you can produce and when. So we made a grid connection application and got one, and that piece of work is £110,000 to supply and connect to the grid. The last thing you need is a power purchase agreement. When we started this project development, I set up a spreadsheet, and the entire purpose of the turbine was to deliver cash to Lawrence Weston, lest we forget. We started out with the community. The entire process, the entire raison d'etre was to produce some profits. So I put in a number. I said it cannot fall below £48,000 a year, enough to employ 2 people, say, to get some real cash benefits into the local community at Lawrence Weston. And that number never changed. And then you'd have to say, well, so I went through all the tendering process to find the turbines, to find the civils companies who could do the work, to make the grid connection and all of the rest of it. And you end up looking at I probably should have mentioned this during finance, but the civil works is going to cost 1.2 million and the turbine about 3 million. We don't know exactly. It's quite a lot of money. So you have to take out a construction loan. You end up owing a debt. It's like a mortgage. we don't own it, the community own it. And the debt has to be repaid, otherwise the banks get quite upset. And it's repaid from the revenue. The power purchase agreement, sales of electricity need to be good enough to pay off the debt. And my model looked, well, it's kind of, a couple of years ago, kind of just about doable, because there are no CFD contracts for difference, which is a government support mechanism essentially for larger projects and offshore wind. And there used to be more subsidies like feed-in tariffs, which again were which ran out when our government decided it was a bad idea. And there was also NOFO's, non-fossil fuel obligations. So some old plant is still running under FITS CFDs, and NOFO, actually offshore, is running under CFDs, none of which were available to us. So we were on our own, and we had to make it work financially, and it was very tough until you might have heard somebody invaded the Ukraine, and gas and electricity prices shot up, and we found that our I'm exposing the profiteering side of renewable energy here, but it's a fact that the electricity price available today is probably 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 times what it was a year ago in terms of getting a power purchase agreement at the peak. And that's possibly, sorry, I'm confusing two things. Instead of sort of £60 a megawatt hour, 6 pence, which is enough to pay off the debt. Let me just say that if it costs about 4 pence or 4.5 pence to make a kilowatt hour and you're selling it for 6, you've got a bit to pay off the debt and a bit for maintenance. That's the thing. You could get a 1-year or a 2-year power purchase agreement fixed at 4 times that today, sort of 224 pence. So you're producing it for 4 pence or 4.5 pence, selling it for 24 pence, and you can pay off your debt faster. So this is magic, you see, for folks like us. It's also very good for the large privately owned companies who are massively profiting. But what we will do with it is pay off the debt and then provide very, very much larger and enhanced profits to the community. I mean, by that 48,000 a year could increase dramatically, should increase dramatically. So that all seemed very good. And we're still negotiating a PPA, but it will be advantageous to the community. There is political risk that the government will decouple electricity prices and gas prices, and the prices will come down, but we still feel that it'll be better than £60 or 6 pence. So geopolitics has come into it again. So right, the site is here, next to the estuary, which is top left on the screen. There's a road, gas pipeline, oil pipeline. There's a gas-fired power station just to the northeast of it, big substation to the southeast of it, and this is council land upon which there was sort of a forest, or a scrubby forest, which had been planted by local school children. Unfortunately, we've had to tear that down to build the wind turbine, somewhat too. But the children think it's good. This is the site in a little more detail. I don't know if I can move my cursor. I can't do a cursor for some reason. What you can see in the top right is a dark circle. That's the center of the turbine. The brown bit is the diameter of the foundation, which is about 20 meters. That is comprised of 22 concrete piles, which will be drilled. They're about 800 millimeters diameter and 20 meters deep into the rock, because we're basically building on a swamp. And at the periphery of that 20-meter circle, and then on top of that, a pile cap, which is concrete and up to 2 meters thick in the middle, is connected to those piles and supports the ringer bolts onto which you bolt the turbine. And the concrete in that is about 3,600 tons. And there's 190 tons of steel in it, rebar. I think that's an underestimate. I have to get the right number. Lots of steel, lots of concrete. As you will know, concrete is, in its production, produces a lot of carbon dioxide. So an obvious question is, how long does it take a wind turbine to avoid the production of CO2 that it has created in its manufacture? And the answer is 6 to 9 months. It's just producing energy for free from clean air. It's avoiding the production of CO2, and it pays itself back in terms of CO2 in 6 to 9 months. The other thing you'll see on next to the turbine on the right-hand side, some pink area. There are 2 substations, one for the Western Power and one for us, which we've got our metering stuff in. There are various areas, green and grey and purple. They are lay-down areas for the equipment. The blades go into the area 6 below, which is in the middle of the screen. The blades are 62 meters long. So you're moving, more than half a football pitch. There's 3 of them. They have to lay down there until they're lifted one at a time into place. And the crane you can see across it is, there are very few cranes of this size, and most of them are Hinkley. So that crane extends from near the turbine to within a couple of meters of the road. It's enormous. It's 116 meters long, that boom. Which takes me a long time to walk. Never mind, it's huge. When you see the site, think the crane is going to go from here to that distant place, and then it's going to stand up in the air and lift this machine. The crane itself needs another crane to put it together, which is a 200-ton crane, which sits on the bit of purple colored square. We're going to have an energy learning zone in about zone 5, which will be for visitors, children and so on, to familiarize themselves with what this enormous thing is doing there and how it works and so on. So the turbine will arrive on the 30th of January with total Germanic efficiency, and the crane will arrive, and in the early week of February, this thing will be erected in about a week. With incredible precision. You've got to lift blades and tower sections weighing 80 tons and position them within millimeter accuracy to then bolt them down, stacked one on top of the other. Generator is in 2 pieces, hubs in 1 piece, the blades go in 1 at a time. It's quite a piece of I can't wait, basically. So as I'm near my allotted time, I thought I'd allow people to ask a few questions, and we've had about 35 minutes. So, and what I haven't said is why it's important, but the building of a single turbine like this has been enormously difficult, as well as very exciting. But to get anywhere near the UK's, let's say, I'm going to say England, because I think, let's say UK's climate change targets, we need to build about 5,000 of them like this a year. That's not quite true. We need 5 gigawatts a year, which is about 1,000 or 1,200 of these a year. So anywhere you can put up a turbine, we need a turbine. And really, I don't care whether you like the look of them or not. You just have to have it. There's no option, no compromise from my part. The UK has 35% of Europe's wind potential, 35%, whether we're inside Europe or not. It's still going to go blowing past our ears across the land and across the seas. And that's an incredible potential. We should not be digging up oil or letting oil licenses in the North Sea. We should be building out enormous offshore and as many enormous offshore wind resources. And that's happening to some extent, but not with any government encouragement, not really. And we need to be developing as much as possible of our onshore resources, because they are much cheaper than the offshore resource. If we build 100 megawatts or 400 megawatts onshore, it isn't you know, whereas offshore might be 4.5 pence, onshore can be down to 3.5 pence. It's much cheaper to build onshore. So we need to be doing a lot more of these, and that's what we plan to do in our next venture, because my little company, Community Power Solutions, formed with David, got a grant from the West of England Combined Authority of 1.5 million to do just that. Anyway, I will wrap up now with a thank you for your attention slide and invite anyone to ask any questions whatsoever. I'll stop sharing again.
Great. Well,
I've got a question which I'm quite nervous of asking because I'm going to sound a complete idiot, but I really want to know. Now, I hope I've understood what happens. We take in the wind from all over the place and we turn it round and round and it powers. Anyway, I think I've got that bit. The bit that I'm puzzling over is, does that make any difference to wind speeds and wind activities further along, presumably in our case to the east?
That's a very good question. There's two aspects to that. There is a local effect. If you're standing behind a wind turbine, it's taking some of the energy out of the wind, so there's less wind. Our turbine is just quite near to Bristol City Council turbines, and they're robbing us of energy when the wind is coming past them into us, and we're robbing them of energy when the wind's going the other way, to the tune of about £25,000 worth a year. So we're paying each other, as it were. Well, we're suffering and we're paying them because they were there first. So there is a decrement in energy. The other aspect of this is quite interesting. All of the winds flowing around the planet end up as, all of that energy ends up as heat. It has to go somewhere. It doesn't keep going. It ends up in whirls and vortices and turbulence, which ends up as it's blowing through trees, resulting in strain energy, blowing past people, buildings, warming things up through friction. All of it disappears as heat. It's an enormous amount of energy that ends up on the planet. By abstracting a bit through a wind turbine, you're changing nothing. You're just turning a bit of it locally into electricity, which will also end up as heat. Ultimately, there's no other place for it to go. So there's a local effect and a global effect, but the global effect is net zero. Thank you.
You are near your thing is near the shore.
Yes.
If as we are told, the sea rising and rising and rising, is it safe there? If the water keeps rising, could it fall down?
That's another good question. We spent a lot of money on flood risk assessment. There is the authorities are building, increasing the height of the dike, if you like, along the Severn, which is nothing to do with our turbine, but we benefit from it. So we didn't have to move the turbine up. We've had to lift the substation up about a foot, but that's not because of coastal flooding. That's because of local flooding on the site we are. There are little water courses, which are drainage reens, I think they're called, which could overflow in winter. So yes, there is a finite but acceptably small flooding risk from coastal flooding over the 30 years life of the turbine. And you're absolutely right. If we don't get climate change under control, we won't be building on the seashore. We'll be building offshore in what was once onshore.
Yeah, brilliant. Charles, are there, you say you chose from a number of sites and eventually zeroed in on this one. This has presumably, your stock probably trades higher now that you've got a successful project going. Are you looking at building other turbines in the same area on the sites that you didn't pick first time? Or
they're obviously on quite a long list. the first target will be publicly owned lands. The reason is that we've got a supportive council, and getting land agreements might be simpler. It took years and years and years to negotiate a lease, and we're paying for it quite heavily, as opposed to privately owned land, because privately owned lands, you might end up with a farmer who sees pound signs and gets a bit greedy. But we can't exclude those, because hilly areas are often farmland, and you have to have the community, and the community often has less impact on privately owned land. So it's not very simple, but we'll be looking at all of those. And there are some, in the last few years, have been some quite comprehensive reports on North Somerset, South Gloucestershire, Baines and Bristol areas, which indicate where you might want to put solar, wind and other stuff. So that we'll be starting from there, and hoping to do it in about 2.5 years, not 7 years.
Yeah. Is that already in process? You're already sort of having early talks, or?
No, it's not. We haven't kicked that off yet.
Okay.
Graham.
What are the relative merits of solar power and wind power in terms of the cost difficulty of establishing them, the continuity of supply, and the final price of the electricity produced?
David can speak more on solar. I would hazard a guess that in terms of the cost of energy, onshore wind is significantly cheaper at the moment, and wind is intermittent but very predictable. Clearly there are times when it doesn't blow, but that's why we have a grid. There are increasing moves to link our grid with Europe, so you're aggregating out windy and non-windy periods. And in addition, as within half a mile of our site in Avonmouth, there's a very large brand new battery storage facility. I'm not quite sure how many megawatts it is, which both solar and wind can benefit from. And I would like to be building in some of these future things, if it's possible, wind along with battery storage at the same time. Does that help answer the question?
And you've also got the field around, where it's probably too big a job to imagine at the time, but the field that you're putting the wind turbine in could also have a solar farm, could it not?
It could, if you put the farm in after the turbine is up, and we're capable of taking the risk that you're not going to have to take the turbine down again at some point.
Yeah.
Yes, so you could have ideally a large turbine surrounded by a solar farm with a big battery plant on the side, and then you've got a perfect mixture. We won't even get into the hydrogen thing, but I think that's where things are heading. I think hydrogen has a massive future for us. And
to try and answer the solar and wind question in less than a minute, you're talking your megawatts costing, it's about £1 million a megawatt, very, very roughly, yeah?
Installed, yeah.
And solar sounds cheaper at more like £500,000 a megawatt, but you're getting 3,000 hours a year of wind energy, roughly speaking, out of a wind turbine, and you only get 950 hours a year of solar energy. So solar's cheaper but less efficient in terms of electricity output. But then again, some solar, you can put solar on people's roofs and avoid grid charges. So which means you can tackle fuel poverty very directly with solar. Charles has some problems, your electricity is coming out 11,000 volts. You can't plug a toaster into that. But
I think the other thing I'd mention is that whilst solar is perfect on domestic roofs, there was a phase or a fad for putting small turbines on roofs, and I do not recommend it. The cost of energy from it is dramatically higher than you're ever going to need to buy from the grid. They don't work. Every company that's ever done that unless you have a farm with an isolated hill, it's just a silly idea. It sounds like a good idea, but it's not. It's an architectural feature. And also these vertical axis ones you see around the city, the one at the bottom of the M32 by Cabot Circle never moves. It's a piece of still art. It's not, it was supposed to be a turbine, but it never, except in the strongest gales. So the technology is and has evolved the way it is for very good reasons. And I've been around in the industry since that time long enough to know that there are lots of avenues of new technology have been plowed, and most of them have fallen foul of, you know, engineering reality or price or something. Sorry, that wasn't answering anybody's question.
Here's a suggestion, which I'd been reading about in a tech book about future energy. And you, David and Charles, you may think that's a pretty ridiculous idea and they should be ashamed of themselves for writing about it. But I will pose it for you. In the future, there will be satellites above the Earth taking power directly from the sun and beaming it down upon Earth stations. What are you folks' views on that?
Well, yes, if you could put a solar collector up in clear space, you'd get a lot. You could arrange for 100% of it in the sunshine all of the time, and then the beam pointing it down to, let's say it's pointing down into a collector in the middle of Champion Square, and somebody has a tremble with their finger and it wipes out the meeting house because the beam's just gone off. You know, there's an enormous. You can only do it. You're going to be economical for enormous amounts of energy. Then you've got this beam. It isn't a wire, a beam, beaming it down to some space, which would have to be safe. And you wouldn't want to fly a plane through it or a bird or stand very close to it. I think, yes. I mean, I think that the best way for bulk solar is for the impoverished countries of the Sahara, and this is not a new idea, it's been around for decades, you know, Morocco, Libya, etc., to be funded by themselves, by Europe, by the World Bank, to build multiple gigawatts of solar and multiple gigawatts of battery stuff if necessary, because there's only a short distance from there to Italy, to Spain, to Greece, to export their power to a power-hungry Europe. Technology is not a problem, it's all there, it's just a question of political will.
Yeah, there is a such thing as concentrated solar power anyway, Ray, where you have on land mirrors pointing up to these towers. And if you want to know more, Google on Ivanpah, I-V-A-N-P-A-H, bird kill. And of course, what happens is the solar power is concentrated. Birds are just migrating. They don't know where they're flying. They fly into this concentrated solar power, they explode. They're just frazzled. So really high levels of bird kill around these things. It's sort of basically, oh, right, well, let's think of something better then.
So I've been in wind power since 1984, about December the 28th, approximately. And I hope I have a few more years in it yet. What I hope is that you and other friends, if there's ever a discussion about renewable energy, you'll say yes. There are so many people who are ready to say, no, don't need that. Just say yes. And then I can justify why you've said yes after the fact if necessary when we're ready for a chat. I'm very happy to sit in for as long as people might have anything to ask me.
You understood that.
Hattie.
Got Hattie as well. Carry on, Ray.
Now, Hattie, carry on.
I'm thinking about the politics of it. I mean, it's hugely important. As you said, even one objection and the bloody government thinks that's the end of the world. You've got to stop it out of respect for one person, you know. Just put a stooge in and stop it all. Oh.
Yes.
Anyway, so that annoys me. But what's the local politics like? I mean, as you said, you've got a favourable council, and is it to do with MPs? Do we write to our MPs? You know, it's not just that, but and who's in charge of the finance? It sounds like central government makes those decisions, and they don't know what they're doing. They're not engineers.
They're not engineers, definitely. Hattie, thank you. Thangham Debonair and Darren Jones. Darren Jones would have been on the board of the company, but he felt there'd be too many, a bit too difficult. He's extremely supportive. He's been to site, and will be coming to site at with Thangham beginning of November. So the Bristol City Council is very supportive, but many cities in the UK do not have such supportive council. So the local politics has been wonderful. We've had massive support from Bristol City Council, even though there are silos which have to, for instance, in terms of land lease, they are required to achieve best value for the land. They're not giving this stuff away. And they did follow through a very robust planning process. No one is bending any rules at all. The national politics is rubbish. It still thinks it's about, well, just got to look at the news. So we just have to get on these things locally, and local communities and towns and councils are, you know, online saying, how can we copy you guys?
You need 5,000, you know, that's a sea change.
Yes, but there's plenty of, you know, when we used to be able to drive to that little place called Europe, you'd go across northern Germany, there's lots of wind turbines everywhere. I don't regard them as a block of land on the landscape. Some people might, but if we have a chance of producing enough green energy, we need wind power and solar power in lots of places. Much of it will be offshore and out of sight, but a community to be able to directly benefit by having one on its local hill seems to me entirely sensible. And if it's, you know, Dundry Hill, 5 turbines up there would produce enormous amounts of energy. It's a lovely spot. You'd still be able to go for a walk and they just go. That's it, barely audible. But there are objectors, you know, and I don't know, I'm not answering any of your question, Hattie.
Okay.
No, a quick piece of input though. Were there to be a change of government, and it's quite likely there will be in a couple of years, at least the Labour at their annual conference announced a very positive energy policy. They're planning to double the amount of onshore wind, triple the amount of onshore solar, quadruple the amount of offshore wind. They will set up a national energy company to finance all this, and it will build on the back of an initiative from local authorities, which is that the 11 or 12 core cities plus London have got together to raise money to take the cities carbon neutral, and they're looking to raise £200 billion. It's a huge amount of money, and when that happens, there will be regulatory changes. And when there's a change of government, there will be regulatory changes. So, Charles, you know, it's this lot put in the rules to make things harder for renewables. The next lot might change all of that very dramatically. Yes. And open the not so much floodgates, but gates of heaven for renewable energy. And
the real, as I've said in my talk, Hattie, the difficult money is the development money, because that's risky. The construction finance is available because the technology will work, the wind will always be there. You've got an agreement to supply energy, got a grid connection, got a maintenance agreement. So this facility, this generating facility, will get finance. So the construction finance, which is the big number, is easy in inverted commas, whereas the development finance to get to that point is all risky. We've spent, I say we, the Lawrence Weston project, before anyone arrived at the site, spent about £420,000 risky development money. And the total development, we're paying some of that back. The model is the construction finance includes a fund which will repay some of that development back. We call it a groan. So it's not a grant, it's not a loan. It's a contingent loan. A contingent loan from a group like City Funds, Bristol Council City Funds, is the criteria that if the project does not go ahead, it's not repayable, it's a grant. If the project does go ahead, it repays the money. So we're recycling some of those funds back in. And I think that's the model to use, such that those who might have the inclination to provide risk finance have an incentive to make it work. And if it works, they get the money back, and then they can do the next one and round, next one.
And presumably for the same amount of money that you've put in to develop one turbine, it wouldn't have cost a lot more to develop 4 or 10 turbines.
We could have developed 200 for almost the same price. It's been a very
as a person who likes to push people forward occasionally, and we have with us today Graham, who is I know a Green Party person. Do you have any views, Graham?
So I think the progress.
And can you shout, Graham? Your audio is very, very quiet.
I think the progress the Labour Party has made recently in supporting various forms of renewable energy is encouraging and inspires hope. The Green Party, of course, will always be alongside and pushing any government to move in that direction. But at the moment we have one MP, and though she's very good, does her best, what is one amongst so many?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Two of those MPs will be visiting the site in November, and I issue hereby an invitation to anyone who wishes to see it, particularly when we're putting a turbine up February next year. I think we should have a meeting like this and a charabang to site to observe from the safe bit behind the fence this enormous piece of technology being put together. There is
a meeting for worship to pray that nothing goes wrong.
Yeah, that would be great.
I'm much more positive. I would pray that everything goes right.
There's an awful lot of things to go right. It's an extremely complicated technical and legal and financial political process, but I'm looking forward to doing it again.
Can I ask you about finance for you? I mean, are you paid anything? Because your brain and your skills and your actions, I mean, look, are you getting paid for this? Lawrence
Weston are paying me and David Tudgy as consultants. We're not taking a proper consultant rate. If we had, the project couldn't have afforded us. I mean, consultants are supposed to earn, I don't know, hundreds of pounds an hour or something. So we're taking enough to help out a bit. Yes, that's, and I think a lot of the effort from the community obviously is unpaid. Our board are unpaid. Community members agitating, going out, leafleting and so on, and talking to people that were unpaid. So very grateful to all of that support.
Is there anything we can do?
I think we just promote the next wind turbines. I mean, I'm not asking for funds. Thank you if that was a suggestion. I'd be happy to contribute to sort of the knowledge base, if there were such a thing that Friends might have, or yearly meeting might have, as to how this is supposed to happen. Because I'm sure that meeting houses around the nation, this is just speaking off the cuff really, represent, or in communities, let's say, you know, in a windy part of Yorkshire, say, oh, wouldn't that be a great idea? And down in Bristol, there's somebody who seems to have done it. So yeah, I'd be happy to help get the word out, but I'm not quite sure how to do that. I could repeat the talk to anybody that's prepared to listen, of course.
The Friend magazine, or the publications that the Quakers make.
Also, Quakers in, I know a few years ago, had one yearly meeting where the green agenda was discussed and a lot of papers put forward on that. So, you know, I can safely say, without fear of contradiction from any friend, that the Quakers as a whole body takes the green agenda very seriously and are very committed to the cause in that respect.
There was just a conference a couple of months ago at Woodbrook, the Quakers Learning Centre in Birmingham near Bourneville, a living witness gathering with 70 odd people there, of which I was one, sponsored by Bristol Area Meeting. And it was totally on the topic of dealing with climate change and Quakers rethinking themselves. It was delightfully presented. The meeting was introduced as, you know, when Charles Darwin came out with his work, Quakers had to reinvent themselves because their past was taken away from them and substituted with a new model of evolution. And Quakers had a big conference to rethink, you know, a great rethink of Quakerism 50 years after Darwin. So it's like Quakers aren't hasty, but the context of this conference was the climate change, you know, the reports from the climate change, you know, the whatever, I can't remember the initials for it now. Yeah, lovely, thank you. And they're saying, you know, we need to rethink Quakerism because it's all hands on deck now. We all have to be thinking about our planet and what we do. And one outcome was the idea to hold study days at area meetings around the country to look at what Quakers can do, perhaps working with local MPs to bring communities together. So Quakers having ways of working together that are quite advanced compared with democracy and autocracy.
With the, if a community can be encouraged to have a local community plan and focus on these issues, then renewable energy and other things will happen. You know, buildings will get insulated, people will have warmer homes, the right actions will ultimately be taken. And a lot of communities, I think, have the desire, but perhaps not the know-how or the collective know-how to do this. And maybe Quakers have a role there in getting out in the streets saying, you can do this.
Yeah, I think that's quite a stumbling block, is how am I going to do it? How would I get my street on board? Who would I ask? I'm not a mover and a shaker. I'm not an initiator. I'm always the second. But, you know, if somebody did fancy doing it in our locality, then I'd be right behind them. But yeah, yeah, the communities.
I think supporting and writing to one's MP and councillors can only do good in this regard. As I said, Bristol City Council should be congratulated for enabling this one to happen. Not just the going through the planning process, but the leasing of the land and the yes, that's probably the two key things. But their energy department, energy officers have been very supportive, and so you know we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah.
And talking of what streets could do, we had a citizens' assembly in Bristol a little while ago, and there were a bunch of recommendations, one of which was setting up one-stop shops where people could go to get advice. And another was to set up whole street demonstrators of what is possible. And so I can't imagine us putting a wind turbine at the end of every street, but you could be putting solar roofs and doing retrofits on streets in each neighborhood or constituency. And the idea was that this should be not led or run by the council, because that inevitably means the community get less involved, but the council supporting the community to build capacity to do these things. And I think that's a wonderful idea. And
well, you know, the community can build a wind turbine. It's not going to be on the end of their street. This wind turbine is a few kilometers from Lawrence Weston. A more sensible place would have been, you know, Caithness or somewhere where it's really windy, and the flow of profits to the community still flows through the same financial model, through the same thing. So it doesn't have to be local. It just helps that it is local, because then you get local support in the planning of it.
Yeah.
Whereas a remote wind turbine would require two communities to support each other for the same, towards the same end. And you know, this is the only stuff I know, so I can't talk about domestic solar, or I try not to get involved in other things, because this is the only. I'm one-shaped hammer and I only have one-shaped nail. That's what I know how to do.
Wow.
Well, after an illustrative point like that, may I ask friends if there are any other questions or comments to Charles? If not,
I think I want to write down the name of your company.
I can put it in the chat. So chat, where's chat gone? It's Community Power Solutions.
is it a bit early to hope that there's a website for it?
There's a website, yes.
Okay, I will put that link to the website in the notes under the video.
I'm not able to open the chat for some reason.
Oh, well.
Chat previews.
Is it under more?
Can't even see.
So I think the menu will come up if you touch the screen right top. I don't know if you've got a touch screen, or have you got a little red label saying leave?
The chat's working. There's
we got the chat. Yeah.
I can't see the chat dialog box. So.
It should be at the bottom of your screen, but your screen may be a bit different to other people's.
Show chat previews. Chat. Oh, there we go. Right. Okay. Right.
There we go. Great. And you can, anybody who wants to keep this, as I say, it will be on the video link when we put this up on YouTube.
.co.uk, is that right?
You need to hit return or something.
Yeah, just I'm just correcting the spelling. Is
David, would this be a good time to put out the message to people, or ask people here now whether anyone would have any objections?
That's a really good point. Normally, we don't allow people to discover these talks when they're posted on YouTube. Does anybody have any objection to being seen?
No.
yeah.
That's good. Thanks for mentioning that, Patsy.
I was a bit remiss in mentioning next week's talk, which has, I think, the final talk from Jenny Smith.
No, that's the week. Sorry, that's the week after. Ray. Next week, David's talking about how we can have cheaper energy.
So
I sit corrected.
It could be me that sent it out one way around, in which case I do apologise. I hope not.
Yeah. One should have it right.
Yeah, but
So-
it might be.
Right.
So
Thank you,
could we-
friends.
Can we invite Frank along to that Zoom meeting about David cheaper energy?
yeah, and invite them to watch Charles's video before they come along, so that they're well informed and we're able to sort of drive the discussion further forward.
Yes, I'm just sending an invite to everyone to let's hire a charabang or something in there.
Yeah, good.
Very good idea. Yeah.
Good, Charles. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that amazing information.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's great. It's great too that people are happy to have it shared, have the talk shared out, because we can all perhaps distribute it to people we think might be interested.
If I'd known that, I would have made it slightly more slick.
It's wonderful.
It's,
It's suited the audience.
it's perfect.
Yeah, it's a general audience, isn't it, Charles? But if you, I suppose we could give it. No, we could. You can't give it back to people to amend, can you? With Zoom.
It's fine. It is what it is.
Okay.
We can put additional thoughts and stuff and links.
Thank you, friends.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
thank you.
Hello.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.